Welcome to our review of ACLED's 2024 Conflict Index. The Conflict Index calculates how conflicts in every country and territory in the world vary according to four indicators of deadliness, danger to civilians, geographic diffusion, and the number of active armed groups. Using political violence event data from the past 12 months, the ACLED Index identifies the country or territory with the highest score on the individual indicators, as well as the top 50 countries and territories experiencing extreme, high, or turbulent levels of conflict as a combined score on the four indicators. Palestine is the most dangerous place with the most diffuse conflict at present. Myanmar's conflict continues to generate the most armed groups, and Ukraine remains the most deadly. Based on these combined scores for these indicators, the most extremely violent places are Palestine, Myanmar, Syria, Mexico, Nigeria, Brazil, Lebanon, Sudan, Cameroon, and Colombia. So those hoping for a peaceful 2024 will have been massively disappointed, as this year has been extraordinarily vicious. We entered 2024 with two wars in Palestine and Ukraine. We exit it with both having gotten worse through diffusion across the Middle East and brutal surges across Ukraine and Russia. In addition to the depth of violence in both areas, conflict also surged in Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq. Over the past year, conflict events rose by 25%. We have recorded close to 200,000 conflict events and over 233,000 reported fatalities from political violence. These events exposed over 1 billion people to violence. 1 in 8 people live in close proximity to conflict, but conflict is also becoming more concentrated. Those same communities are exposed to many rounds of conflict within short periods. Rather than a diffuse and changing conflict environment, the same places and communities are being attacked several times over. ACLED's Conflict Index demonstrates that the countries with the most conflict in 2024 experienced very different forms of violence. In Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, a regional consistency is evident as these countries each struggle with gangs and their attacks on communities. In Mexico, the government's attempts to curb cartel violence accounts for at most 11% of incidents, and the remaining 89% of violence is dominated by cartel attacks on civilians and inter-cartel fighting, such as the current war in Culiacan. This has massive ramifications as newly elected President Trump considers how, rather than whether, the U.S. should become deeply involved in Mexico's conflicts. In Myanmar, more than 170 non-state armed groups are active per week, and these frequently change. The significant levels of fighting between the military junta and these various groups constitute only half of all conflict. Fighting dozens of groups independently only increases the conflict rate. It has a deleterious effect on whether any group, including the junta, can take control. And so the government attacks civilians to prove its viability and continues to fight the far more entrenched and organized ethnic rebel groups that encircle Myanmar's violent middle region since the coup in 2021. Myanmar's conflict is the very definition of a Sisyphean task. The sharpest increases are in already extremely violent spaces, and a number of the largest conflicts continue to become more violent. For example, in the midst of extreme conflicts, both Syria and Iraq became more violent. Recent and dramatic shifts in Syria that culminated in Bashar al-Assad's defection and the regime being toppled by the rebel HTS alliance portends more violence rather than less, and the dimensions of which are unknown but undoubtedly complex. Ukraine, with over 50,000 events recorded in the past year, has stayed remarkably stable, while Russia experienced 4 times the rate of violence in 2024 than it had in 2023, with over 12,000 events. This suggests that there is a ceiling to conflict experienced within a country, and one way it can grow is by diffusing into neighboring states. The story of conflict in past decades has been about the enormous shift in the form of non-state armed groups. Rebels have readily morphed into militias. Militias often assume a cartel form, and in countries like Brazil and Mexico, which have been overtaken by gangs marauding in civilian areas, complex and conflicted ties to security services exist. But large conflicts, like those in Ukraine, Sudan, and Gaza, are mainly dominated by forces with the structure, hierarchy, and resources of states. Indeed, when Israel sought to diminish both Lebanon's Hezbollah and Palestine's Hamas, they did so by destroying their leaders, structure, logistical, and community support resources. This has crippled the abilities of both groups to contest a formidable state military, and both will need to drastically change their tactics and expectations to continue. More state militaries involved in conflict is one reason for the rising level of overall violence, and in specific events. When state governments fight other governments, or compete with large established and embedded non-state armed groups, they do so often by employing one of their signature advantages in bombing. Bombing in all of its forms, shelling, artillery, missile strikes, etc., is the event type that has increased most strongly during 2024. As a proportion of all events, bombing has tripled over the past 5 years. Communities, borders, cities, shipping lanes, electrical plants, airports, nuclear facilities have all been bombed in the past year. Violence rates doubled over the past 5 years, but despite this, I am a short-term pessimist but a long-term optimist. Over the past 12 months, there are very few prospects for peace. The ability to cooperate and forestall violent competition over political agendas has eluded peace negotiators. The reasons are that conflict is effective and the benefits are obvious. It is a consistently successful way to gain attention, authority, and control. The costs have never been lower, as fewer guardrails from the international and domestic community are operational, and the sheer level of conflict has made consequences for selective perpetrators a largely political gain rather than a human rights commitment. Next year, I fully expect to see at least a 20% increase, possibly due to violent surges in Iran, Chad, Syria and Iraq, Ecuador and Pakistan. The violence in these places will take on unique and specific patterns, largely based on the political competitions emerging therein. The ACLED Conflict Index details 2024 conflict patterns, and the watch list highlighting the threats to come in 2025 both provide a reliable, independent, and thorough guide to the complex and shifting patterns of conflict currently emerging. Thank you.